All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like, imixwhatilike.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And today we're going to talk a little bit more, once again, about the issue of mixed race or biracial identity, specifically within the African-American or Black American community as it relates to biraciality and related issues. Meghan Markle's been in the news, others coming up. This issue keeps coming back up. So I thought we would want to revisit the issue ourselves, have a little conversation. And I saw this piece recently by the brother who's about to join us, Panama Jackson, titled "My Mother is White, I Am Not," on being biracial without identity issues. I saw it in The Root. He also works with Very Smart Brothas. I want to welcome him to the program. Panama Jackson, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So I want to start by asking you what your point was in that article. Just quickly summarize it for us, and then I have a couple of questions I wanted to raise with you going off of that. But just the title again: "My Mother is White, I Am Not," on being biracial without identity issues. If you could just summarize for us quickly what you were trying to say, I appreciate it, and please go ahead and do that for us.
Yeah, not a problem. The point of the article is that even though I acknowledge that I'm a mixed race child, my father is a Black man from Alabama, my mother is a white woman from France. I've been raised as a Black man. My racial identity is that of an African American. The way that I was raised, my cultural norms, the way I present myself, the way that I acknowledge society views me, are all from a very Black lens, and I both accept it, embrace it, and rather enjoy that. That was the main point of the article. And it was birthed out of lots of these discussions about Meghan Markle, obviously, more recently, because there's a lot of discussion online about the fact that she and other people like her, or even like myself sometimes, who are mixed race, aren't necessarily considered Black by some parts of the community and are considered Black by other parts of the Black community. So just a small exploration into that dichotomy.
Right. So for those who don't know, you and I are just meeting. For those who don't know, I'm also Black father, white mother, specifically a Jewish, European descended Jewish mother, which adds another particular slant to this that I don't know. We can get into, and we've dealt with elsewhere on our site. The question that you deal with in the piece that I saw, who is Black enough, and is Meghan Markle Black enough? I have seen a lot of that come up again, and on the one hand, I'm fascinated by this generational moment where, on the one hand, it seems like the one-drop rule is being expanded and changed and amended. And there has been, as some scholars have put me onto over the years, a move since the 1990s, led primarily by white women with children by Black fathers, to develop the multiracial category because they didn't want their children being associated with Blackness. So there has been, over the last generation or two, this explosion of the multiracial identity in a different way than it has historically played out in this country. But on the other hand, as you point out, there is still this, I think, predominant experience of so-called mixed race with African American mixed race children or youngsters growing up assuming a more or less Black identity. And in fact, in 2011, when I was doing some research, and I couldn't find it before this interview, and I'm really bothered by that, but I'll keep looking for it. There was a study done around 2011 that argued that the new passing was in fact mixed kids passing as Black, as opposed to the traditional history of mixed or very fair-skinned Black people passing as white. So I say all that to say, I wanted to get your perspective, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're a generation or so behind me, and I wanted to see where, given your article, where any of that fits with your experience and your, and then I have a couple other issues that have been coming up that I definitely wanted to raise with you as well.
Right. So I definitely ascribe to the one drop rule. I'm one of those people who believes in it. Like I said earlier, I embrace it. I rather enjoy it. But part of that is also because I wasn't raised in a household with my black father and white mother. I was raised in a household with my black father and my stepmother, who was my mama. She raised me. She's my mother. So I grew up in a black household with, I also have a sister. I had 3 sisters. One with my father and birth mother, and then 2 stepsisters. But we don't do that step stuff. We black, so it's all sisters and cousins and all that stuff.
Right.
So I grew up in a traditionally black household with traditional black culture and norms and conversations, and everything was viewed through a very black lens. My father explained to me when I was very young, quite clearly, and that's where the title of that piece came from. That your mother is white, you are not. Don't forget that. Always acknowledge your mother. That's your mother. Don't ever get it twisted. So clearly to me early on, I never struggled with that. The only time I ever had to deal with this mixed race identity, whatever it is when I would go visit with my mother during the summers. I grew up overseas in Germany because I'm a military brat. So I would spend the predominance of the year with my father and father and stepmother in Germany. And then we spend the summers with my mom in Michigan. And she remarried to a white man, and they lived in an all-white town. So that's the only time I ever really had to deal with the whole being mixed thing, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And that's the only time I ever had any experiences that made me look into it, question it, or otherwise engage with it from a mixed lens, right? So the vast majority of my life, I've always been black. I went to an HBCU. Lived in Atlanta. I went to high school in Alabama where, you don't really get that choice to be mixed or not. You're either black or white, it is what it is. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. So my life is a pretty black life, and it's been a very comfortable one, and one that it works for me. So while I do ascribe to the one drop rule, I wouldn't stop anybody or argue with anybody who's mixed from saying, well, I'm mixed. I'm not black. I'm mixed. Do you? Whatever makes you happy, boo. But I think that my own experiences have lent themselves to showing me that if the race war ever goes down, what side actually cares about me or what side is embracing of me. And that's also why societally, while I do think the mixed multiracial thing has become more of a thing, and rightly so, because of white mothers who, they want their whiteness acknowledged in their children. My mother is no different. She just hasn't tried to stop me from being black, but she's definitely wanted me to embrace more of the whiteness, specifically in terms of the women that I date, and all that kind of stuff. But, which I can, honestly, I can understand, right? You kind of view, who your kids, you want them to look a woman that reminds them of you. You know what I'm saying? So I don't blame her for that. It's just it's not that cut and dry when we're talking about black and white issues, especially in this country. So my experience has been a very black one, and on purpose, with intention, and I'm excited as hell about it. And that's I didn't.
But at one point in your article, in response to someone else who was critical of something else that you had written previously, which I also thought was pretty funny, the question of who you would invite to this barbecue, this cookout.
Yeah.
And just a quick aside, and people should go read this and they'll get where I'm going. But just a quick aside, Barkley can never come to my cookout. Just he
That's
is
fine.
Permanently excluded from mine. But anyway,
I'm good with that. No complaints here. He's out. That's okay.
But in response, you had said, sort of almost. Well, I don't know this contradiction. Here you're saying that you don't begrudge how people want to identify, but you did make the point that even with Meghan Markle, who maybe, like many of us didn't have quite the black experience that you had growing up, she doesn't have a choice. That society has labeled her black. The Crown and all these other people have made it an issue of her blackness. That she is black, because you had invited her to that cookout. By the way, that's the. I'm sorry. And some people were saying, well, that she and Jones and other mixed folks shouldn't or couldn't or maybe should be questioned because they're not black enough. And so my point is, you've identified and grown up with a black sort of centered experience.
Right.
Others who have not are seen by many Black people, and I think justifiably, as at least with one eyebrow raised, like, how Black are you? Are you Black enough to really be here? And not just to be at a cookout, and this is really where I wanted to go,
right.
but politically, like when it comes to deciding Black politics and Black movement directions and things like that, where does how Black you are play into this? And that kind of goes back even to that study I talked about earlier,
right.
where if most of us are passing, quote unquote, as Black, at what point are we doing a disservice to this Black struggle by not fully identifying ourselves as mixed, or recognizing, as you were just sharing, the biases inherent in some of our family members or in some of our upbringing?
Right. And that's that's a good question. I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine who is mixed, extremely fair skinned. I mean, he's discussed with me that people don't even assume that he's Black when they see him. Kind of like he's that fair skinned. I have a child. My 1-year-old son is extremely fair skinned with very long and straight hair. His mother's Black. She's from Ghana, but it's he might have that similar struggle. So, in terms of like actively engaging with the community, in terms of the politics and all that, I think you need to get in where you fit in, but it needs to be authentic, right? So I feel comfortable writing on a site called Very Smart Brothas and talking about Black issues because that's how I identify, and nobody's going to question my authenticity about the conversation and the perspectives that I bring. It's rooted in something. You can tell it's rooted in something. I can back up what I say. I talk it like I walk it, right? And so I'm comfortable in that space, me personally. And I know that's because of the experiences that I've had, and ultimately because my parents created a space for me to be mixed, Black with a white mom. They made me be able to be Black with a white mom, right? If that's not your experience and you know that, then why you should still come to the cookout, because ultimately when the race war happens, you got to come to one. But I think you know your lane, you get it, and you get in where you fit in. And if your experiences are like you're Black societally, but the way that you were raised is not one that lends itself to that definitive Black experience, then it's okay to acknowledge it. I just hope there are no rude awakenings once you realize it. At the end of the day, you are in fact Black. I think that's for me what I'm trying to avoid for many people. Like, yes, live your life and experience. One job pool, I'm good with it. But if that's not you, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is there's how you identify and how society is going to look at you at the same time. And it's good to be aware of both, because depending on the situation you're in might determine what you need to, how you need to approach the situation and how you need to engage with it. So, I don't know that I think it's contradictory necessarily, but I mean, I get what you're saying. Like, if your experience is not one that's rooted in Blackness, should you be actively blacking it up, so to speak? And I don't know how else to say that, but and maybe not. But don't go out of your way to point out that you ain't Black when you're talking around a bunch of Black people. You know what I mean? Like, you are. It's cool. It's okay. Like, we know you're mixed too. We know. Like, we know. You know what I'm saying? So it doesn't have to be such a thing. I think that's the problem. A lot of people turn it into a thing where it's like, I don't want to overstate my place in a Black experience because I don't have these experiences, and that's fine. But none of the rest of us are pushing you away. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're like, all right, you good. Like, you just keep pointing this out, and it's kind of annoying.
Right.
You wish you would stop. Like, white people don't want to hear that you half white, just like Black people don't want to hear that you ain't Black. You know what I'm saying? Like, just live your true self is it's corny and it's cliche, but it's also very accurate. And getting in where you fit in, just again, corny and cliche, but I think it's pertinent and I think it's appropriate here. It's just, you don't have to be the leader of the Black cause to be a Black person.
Right.
There are people who can do that, who are more than happy to do it and take that mantle. But, just being aware of what it means to be you, what it means to be Black is also something that doesn't take a whole lot of work. You can read a couple articles and have even white people get it. Some white people even get it. You know what I'm saying? So, being mixed doesn't have to be this, in my estimation, and I might be underselling it because of my own experiences. I don't think it has to be this this super complicated headache that you have to deal with on a daily basis, I can understand why it creates issues in life and dealing with family in particular. But you can also just be like, I'm mixed. That's who I am. I love my black side. I love my white side. And, you know, you find your community that works for you, but also be aware that whatever side whoever you're hanging with most might not have your best interest at heart. And I guess that, you know, I don't mean to come down on white people in that regard, but
I've always felt it was, and I appreciate all that. I've always felt it was pretty clear that regardless of what your particular experience is, white people, the definition of whiteness in this country, and it does change, you know, like being mixed here is different than being mixed in Latin America, for instance.
Right.
But in this country, white people have been very clear that the category of white is very limited.
Yes.
And it took even years of fighting to get other groups of white people into it. Whereas blackness in this country has been very expansive and very welcoming. Not that it's perfect, you know.
Right, obviously.
Certainly. So your point about this coming race war, I mean, you know, to me, the choice won't be possible.
It's not a hard one, right?
It's not that it's a hard one. It's that it won't be possible because white society collectively can't accept the so-called mixed or biracial person, regardless of fairness or regardless of complexion. So, you know, individuals are one thing, and our individual parents or families are one thing, but collectively, whiteness as a category isn't expansive like that in this country, which is why I've been fascinated at some of the reaction and some of the responses. And one reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because, you know, I see, you know, on the one hand, I see black people in this country foolishly, in my estimation, putting like a triumphant accomplishment on this wedding with Markle, and at the same time, so which I think is just ridiculous. Saying, you know, by, you know, at the same, claiming her as black and claiming her as a victory for black people, and on the other hand, I'm seeing people say, well, wait a minute, is this a victory for black people when she's mixed? And I'm saying, regardless what she's, you know, however she identifies or whether she's counted as black or not, it's not a victory for black people.
It's not. No, I agree.
It's not a collective victory for anybody. Her individual wedding is, you know. But anyway, but at the same time, it also, to me, is a reminder of how little has changed in this country in terms of how controversial all this is. And that it's also a reminder that it's not just so-called mixed people who are so-called confused, that there is confusion and identity crises and a misunderstanding and poor self-concepts across the board.
Agreed.
You know, so anyway, I just wanted to have a quick conversation with you about that. I appreciated reading what you had said and enjoyed the cookout piece, and wanted to have some sort of depth added to what I'm seeing floating around on this issue. Any last thoughts or concluding responses to what I've said and that you might have? Please go ahead.
Yeah. You know, I've learned a lot in these processes myself, right? You know, as I've written more about being mixed in my experience, I've kind of had to come to the realization that my experience is not remotely like a lot of other people's experiences, it seems, you know. And for a long time, I viewed my own mixedness through that lens, right? Like, you know, hey, I'm balanced, I'm good, like I can, you know, but everybody wasn't raised the way I was either. And I realized that if you grew up in a house, had I grown up in a household with my mother, as opposed to my father and my stepmother and that family and the way that we were, my stepmother's also a black woman from the South too. So I have two Southern black people where, again, the concepts of race are pretty cut and dry. So there's no real, skirting around any of that. Had I grown up differently, maybe I'd view things a little bit different. You know, maybe I wouldn't be who I am. Maybe I wouldn't have gone to Morehouse on purpose. Maybe I would have gone somewhere else and I would have gone down a different path. So, you know, I realize, and I don't want to shortchange the mixed conversation and not be understanding of the fact that a lot of people's experiences are different, and how you were raised and who raised you largely determines how your identity is going to form in life. But at the same time, I do think it's important that if you're going to talk about being biracial and mixed and all that, it does require an acknowledgement and acceptance of both sides. And that black side is a very important one to acknowledge because of the social constructs that exist in this country.
Well, I've always liked, I always quote her on this. I've always liked what Dream Hampton has said about this. She said, my acceptance of a black identity is no more a rejection of my white mother than my acceptance of as a feminist identity is a rejection of my black father.
You can love one thing without hating the other, right?
And for me, and for me, it's always like, on the one hand, and this is a conversation with you, I'm not going to get too autobiographical, but I will say that what I've always thought and been encouraged to is that it's not, at some point, it's not just a question of who I am or where I fit in. It's a question of how collectives of humanity are being treated. And it's to say, well, why would I not want the same standard of sovereignty, freedom, equality and power for one side of my family as I do for the other? And where I see there's an obvious deficiency on the black side, my response and where I was encouraged was, you get in the most radical wing of that effort to bring that equality to that community. So, I mean, it's on some level, like for me, the addressing the identity issue has been done through politics more than anything else, and seems to be quite a logical conclusion for me. Like, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what I think of myself or what other people see me as. It's a question of how are, in this case, black people treated collectively in this specific society and then elsewhere that drives my own experience, my own identity, and my own conclusions. But anyway, I just want to throw that in there. I didn't mean to fully cut you off there.
It's perfectly fine. I mean, it seems like we're both on the same side on this one in terms of at least our understanding and the nuance and all that. And I love the fact that my mother is white. It's made for some of the most interesting conversations I've ever had in my life, with her in particular. And, but that doesn't stop the fact that I'm a black dude with a white mom. And what it does is give me different worldviews on things and expands the way that I look at things. But it also further emboldens me in the way that I view myself and where I go with my self-identity and what I use it for and why I choose to do so. Just like any other perspective and experience. I mean, I grew up overseas, that kind of expanded my mind in a lot of different ways too. So, I think these conversations are necessary, especially as what I learned in commentary and the comments I'd see on these things, that there's a lot of mixed people, specifically black and white, who want to talk about this and discuss like racial identity and want to, they're itching to do that in a comfortable and safe space without being shut down immediately, right? Because that does happen sometimes. Because again, like if you keep pointing out how not black you are, who wants to hear that? You know what I mean? So I think that these conversations are necessary, especially as the world becomes more multiracial, right? And as we start dealing with kids who have 17, there's so many different ethnicities in us all now. So,
but at the same time, it's also becoming more white supremacist and white elitist. So
they're clawing right now. They're coming for it right now. But,
I mean, people have pointed out that by 2050, this country, for instance, is going to be majority black and brown. But it'll be it will be more akin to apartheid South Africa, where a white minority has all the money, all the land, all the power. So there may be this explosion of multiracial identities, but that's not shifting power relationships and social relationships, which is again why I think these kinds of conversations need to be,
they're necessary. Yeah.
And then, and some depth needs to be added, at least to what I'm seeing out in response to some of the popular cultural or pop cultural references to being mixed or multiracial. Right. So, anyway, Panama Jackson, thank you very much. Very smart brothers, The Root. I appreciate you joining us for this conversation. Again, the piece we were talking about that you wrote is titled "My Mother is White, I Am Not: On Being Biracial Without Identity Issues." Thanks again for joining us here at I Mix What I Like.
Thank you for having me.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.